What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to the channel. So this is part 2 in my little mini series that's a debrief / lessons learned from my trip to Yellowstone National Park. And in this episode, which I think is going to be the episode that most of you are going to be interested in, I want to talk about things that I learned about the gear from shooting in Yellowstone that I hadn't otherwise experienced or learned otherwise. So I'm going to be talking in this video about the two cameras that I took, my R5 and my R5C. I'm going to be talking about my 100 to 500. I'm going to be talking about my MacBook Pro M1. So without further ado, let's jump right in to talking about the gear. The first thing I want to talk about in this video is the things that are common between the R5 and R5C and the problems and things that I ran into that were both good and bad. So on the bad side, the first problem that I ran into was the viewfinder and screen brightness of both cameras when shooting in snow. Now, I have shot outside with my R5. I've shot air shows with my R5 here in Florida at midday. I've never had a problem like that I had with the camera as I had shooting in snow in Yellowstone. The only time I actually have had a problem sort of being able to see the screen or viewfinder in Florida has been when I'm shooting directly into like a setting sun, which obviously the sun's low on the horizon. There's a lot of light coming into your direction. You know, there's a ton of glare. It's hard to see. Briefly, the problem with snow as I see it is twofold. First of all, it's incredibly bright. It's very reflective. That means that there's a lot of light shining in your eyes, and even with sunglasses on, your pupils are going to be incredibly heavily contracted. Compounding that, of course, is that the glare comes from like every direction. It's coming up from the ground, it's coming in from the side, it's obviously some sunlight is coming down from above, so even if you're wearing a hat with a brim, whatever, that helps, obviously, because it blocks some of the light. It provides some shade over the display if you're, for example, with the EVF in close. But it doesn't stop everything because there's light pouring in from everywhere with the snow. Now, so that's the person side of the problem. The camera side of the problem is that the LCD on the R5 and R5C is only capable of producing about 630 nits. So it's only about as bright as an iPhone 12 with the screen in standard, not the peak HDR brightness. It's a little dimmer than an iPhone 13. That's not, I mean, it's usable in most circumstances, but when you combine it with the fact that the snow is just, everything's incredibly bright and your eyes are as contracted as they can get, your pupils are as contracted as they can get, it makes it really hard to see the screen. So I don't think putting a brighter panel in the camera is a good solution. Ultimately, I really feel like you're fixing the camera for an edge case. Now, it'd be great to see capabilities continue to expand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just not sure that this is that big of an edge case or that strong of an edge case that I'd rather give up battery life or something for that. I had sort of I had one mitigation that I used in the field, which was wearing a hat with a dark, the underside of the brim was very dark. And that helped some. It wasn't a perfect solution. It cut down on some of the reflected glare so that I could see essentially the EVF. And if I didn't point it out or mention it specifically, I had problems with both the EVF and the LCD. It wasn't like I just couldn't see the LCD. There were times where the EVF was very washed out and incredibly difficult to clearly see due to, as I said, the brightness in the environment. So the hat helped. It didn't actually solve all of the problem, but it certainly helped with some of the problem. So future me here, I'm doing this as I'm editing this video, which has come out after, which I recorded this before I did the video for adjusting the LCD brightness on the R5C. And it turns out a huge mitigation, or at least something that would have been a really useful mitigation to the whole brightness in the snow problem, is, at least for the R5C, is actually knowing how to adjust the brightness on the camera for the LCD. I had made the assumption before I left, or when I was there, that it worked a lot like the brightness on the R5. You just turn the brightness up and it would be, there'd be a range where you were controlling the backlight, and that would switch over to a range where it was just bringing the blacks up, making the blacks brighter, but not actually increasing the backlight level. It turns out that that's not the case at all. There's an LCD luminance setting that controls the backlight level, and the LCD brightness setting actually just changes the black and white levels for the screen. So when I was out shooting in the field and I couldn't see the LCD at all, the reality is that the panel was only running at about 250 nits as opposed to the 720 nits that it can run at maximum power. So it would have been three times brighter, or three times brighter if I had actually been able to, or knew how to turn it up properly when I was out shooting. Now, of course, if you're shooting video, and maybe to a lesser extent stills, if you're on a tripod, you could certainly use a high brightness external monitor or a high brightness external monitor with an EVF attachment. That has, I guess one of the nice things about shooting mirrorless now is that you can put a monitor on your camera, and it's really, as kludgy as it feels to me that, doing that would be, it also is really going to show you exactly what the camera is seeing. It's not like a DSLR where, when you put it in live view mode, you had some limitations because you didn't have as good of AF, or you didn't have, the etc. With a mirrorless, everything is running through the monitor or through the chip and out essentially the same monitor port anyway, so, that works. In general, though, I think shooting in the snow with a mirrorless is just flat difficult, and you're going to have to expect some difficulty in the displays for the, at least the foreseeable future. Okay, so that was the negative. The positive. I was very impressed with Canon's subject detection for animals, and especially for animals that the camera is not designed to shoot. So I shot the whole trip. I was in Yellowstone National Park, bears, elk, moose, bison, pronghorns, the whole shooting match. None of that stuff's anything that Canon advertises the camera as being designed or capable of dealing with. The advertised feature set for animals are domestic dogs and cats and birds. And that's all that Canon advertises that the camera is designed to shoot with. And I had it detecting and boxing bears, pronghorn, elk, you name it. It was the subject detection and tracking appeared to be working. And I say appeared to be working, it appeared to be the subject detection and not the fallback mode, because in my experience, when the camera falls back into the, what do you want to call it, the tracking a subject by color mode, you get a grid of boxes in the autofocus, for the autofocus, not a single box that surrounds the entire detected subject. And I was getting a single box that surrounds the detected subject the way subject detection works on, every other Canon camera, or in the actual positive cases. Now, what didn't work so well on these unsupported animals, well, that sounds weird to say. What didn't work so well for these was eye detection. It could not be relied on at all. There were times where I tried, and instead of picking up the eye, it would pick up the tail or a spot on the body somewhere or something like that. It just wasn't reliable, which honestly is expected as far as I'm concerned. The camera hasn't been programmed to find bears or bison or elk or moose or anything like that. The training or the subject detection hasn't been trained on that, so it's kind of impressive that it actually found what it found. Additionally, I did run into some I call them issues, unreliability with detecting subjects towards the extreme edges of the frame. I don't know if this is worse or better than it would be if I was working with supported animal species or supported subjects. It was kind of a thing that was there, but it kind of wasn't. it never was an issue. Like, I could have something in the, framed on the third, rule of thirds lines, and it was still detect and track that. It was mostly picking something up when it was at the very edge of the frame. So if I picked it up in the center, say the center half or 2/3 of the frame, it would pick it up fine. It would track it. It worked fine. But if I tried to pick it up on the extreme edges, it didn't work, basically. It was not very reliable. On top of that, one of the things that I discovered, I shouldn't say discovered, that's not, one of the things that I ran into that I half expected to run into, but I wasn't entirely sure, is the old grass in front of the bear problem, where the autofocus focuses on the highest contrast thing inside of the focus point, and in many cases that would be the blades of grass that were in front of the bear I was trying to photograph as opposed to the bear that I was trying to photograph, and it still is a problem with mirrorless cameras. Now, I'm not sure exactly what can be done about this. Well, some of what could be done about this is obviously, one thing that could be done about this would have been not using subject detection. It would have been using shooting from a tripod and using the spot AF point, putting it on exactly what I was trying to focus on, the head of the bear, the shoulder of the bear, whatever, magnifying, ensure that I didn't have grass interfering, and then focusing and shooting like that. That would have worked great if I was not shooting handheld. I was shooting handheld most, if not all of the time, actually. So the subject detection was a crutch that I was really leaning on, especially once I realized it was working as well as it was, to be able to stop having to manipulate controls or as many controls on the camera and still be able to shoot pictures. Having the other thing that could seriously help this problem, I think, is having actual subjects that I was shooting, so bears, elk, moose, bison, as part of the supported animal set with working eye detect. Eye detection minimizes the size of the focus box. It therefore makes it much higher probability that the focus box is not going to be covering an intervening piece of grass, and it's only going to be on the animal's eye or a small part of the animal's head, and therefore it increases the likelihood that the camera won't focus on the higher contrast grass instead of the lower contrast animal fur, etc. And that's ultimately what the problem is here. It's not a mirrorless camera problem. It's not a Canon camera problem. It's a straight up, the autofocus system is focusing on the thing that has the highest contrast that's easiest for it to I won't say easiest, but for it to get into focus. And if you're, say, photographing a black bear, the black bear is black hair, or brown hair for that matter, with black shadows, but the hair is very fine. There isn't an awful lot of detail. Yes, the camera can focus on it, but if there happens to be a bright green piece of grass that's in front of the bear, and under the autofocus point, the camera has this much higher contrast thing that the autofocus system is going to go, oh, that's easy to get in focus, and it's going to hit that instead of hitting the bear. So, in this vein, this is what I'd like to see Canon do. First of all, I'd like to see a commitment, and this isn't specific from this trip, but I'd like to see a commitment from Canon to continue to increase the number of detectable subjects that the cameras can support across the board for all of the cameras that are out there for some foreseeable amount of time. Not until the next camera comes out and then we stop doing anything for the R5. Oh, the R5 Mark II's out, so the R5 we aren't going to do any more updates. I shouldn't have to buy, and we've seen a little bit of this, but we haven't seen a commitment to it. So the EOS R3 brought vehicle detect. Vehicle detect was retroactively applied to the R5, R6. It's now in the R7. I think it's in the R10 as well. It's core to the autofocus system. But at some point the R5 is going to be obsolete by Canon's standards. It's going to be the discontinued model. There's going to be an R5 Mark II, and that is going to impact what happens or what's available for the R5. Now, the problem that I end up having with this ultimately is cameras have gotten technologically, in terms of image quality, picture performance, frame rate, tracking capabilities, or autofocus capabilities, not necessarily subject detection. Cameras have gotten to a point where the need to upgrade, upgrading is increasingly coming with diminishing returns. My R5 has 50% more resolution than my 5D Mark III had, or Mark IV had. It does not produce pictures that are 50% better. We are well past the point where you have enough resolution to make good images. Upgrading a camera just to get more resolution is not, strictly speaking, going to give you better results. So the effective or the usable lifetime of modern digital cameras is increasing. It's getting longer. You don't need to buy, and I'm saying this from the perspective of, like, obviously you don't need to buy every new camera that comes out. You don't need to buy, even unless you are a top 0.1% photographer, professional photographer, you don't need to buy every generation of camera at this point, or a new camera every 2 or 3 years, because the technology is not progressing from generation to generation in a way that's delivering the kind of returns that we saw back in the mid-2000s. Going from a 40D to a 50D to a 60D, there was actually pretty significant gains across the board in the camera that just don't happen here. So I'd like to see a commitment for Canon to continue to upgrade the autofocus system. I mean, on top of that, I'd like to see a commitment from Canon to continue to improve or increase the number of detectable subjects, just straight up as a thing. Like, not even talking about, well, we're going to, in response to possible competition or in response to this, just a straight up, we're adding African big game, we're adding American big game, we're adding European big game, we're adding, etc., amphibians, fish, whatever. And to be completely honest with this whole thing, I would not have a problem if these extended, enhanced, whatever you want to call it, autofocus subject detection things are something that I have to plug my camera in and configure or upload, similar to the way picture styles work, so you can upload your own custom picture styles, or the way that lens corrections work for lenses that are not so common. They're not supported in there, or they're not installed in a camera out of the box. You have to upload them from the EOS utility, whatever. You have to upload them from your computer. And I would have no problem with this, because quite honestly, at least from like a wildlife photography standpoint, I'm never in a position, or at least I should say just general in my experience with photography, I'm never in a position where I'm, first of all, ever going to be shooting, outside of a zoo, in which case the situation is completely different, and very artificial. I'm never going to be shooting, say, a grizzly bear standing next to a giraffe. It's not, that's not a reasonable way for wildlife in the world, in the wild, that actually works. So if I have to, and for that matter, I'm not going to go from shooting a motorsports event, to shooting a wildlife situation in such a short time that I can't plug my camera in, download pictures, and upload a different autofocus subject detection package. So I have no problem with telling the camera, or if it can't all be stored in the camera in the firmware, I have no problem like turning off or removing the vehicle detection and having a domestic animals package and birds and a North American big game package. It's like bears, elk, deer, etc. I have no problem with that. In fact, I almost think that's probably having that kind of thing would be a better way to go in my mind, as that would allow Canon to continue to release new packages without having to continue to mess with the firmwares for older cameras. Second of all, I would like Canon to provide better information on how the camera focuses on detected subjects when subject detection is used. So when you're doing subject detection, you can have a fairly large area of the frame detected as a subject. Where is it focusing inside of that box? So I ran into issues in two places on this trip where the box surrounding the bear, due to the way the bear was, there was grass behind it in the top, say, right corner, and there was grass in front of it in, say, the bottom left corner. So the bear was kind of angled towards me. And in certain instances, I had the camera focus on the grass behind the bear, or at least it seems to. And in other instances, I had it focus on the grass in front of the bear. Bear was detected. The bear was boxed. Of course, like I said, bear fur is not exactly the highest contrast thing in the world for a camera to focus on. Where and how is the camera focusing inside that box? Canon has not provided any information to my knowledge that I have ever seen on specifically how the camera focuses, prioritizes anything inside of a large subject detected box. Finally, given what I've seen, I would really like a way to sort of prioritize an area in the box for focus. So maybe it's not the most high contrast part of the box, but I know it's the box that's most likely to have the thing I want to focus on in focus. So yes, it subject detects the whole bear. I only want the camera to focus on the middle third or middle half of that box and ignore the top and the bottom, because I know that the top and the bottom are going to have interfering, say, brush hanging down, grass coming up, something like that, as a configuration option. Somehow, it would mitigate the problem that I was seeing. Barring all of that, what did I do, or what can you do to address this in your own photography in the field? Well, first thing I think is you have to be aware of what you're actually shooting, which this is hard when it's a run and gun situation and the thing's 100 yards away from you and you're at 500 millimeters and you can't see every possible fine detail that the camera could focus on. You have to kind of figure out a way around that, I think. I feel like the magnification capabilities of a mirrorless camera to be able to punch into the one-to-one pixel magnification is really helpful. But in this circumstance, like I said, one of the problems that I kind of ran into is I'm not using a tripod, so punching in and doing magnification is a problem. Additionally, one of the other problems that kind of runs up with this is that you cannot use magnification when you're doing subject detection and tracking, which essentially means that in the mode that I was using, I couldn't just hit the magnify button and then check out that, what the actual, situation was. Is there grass in the way? Is that an issue, etc., in a way that I could if I was using zone or spot or 1 point or the expanded methods. I don't know how much of a workable solution there is from that. Certainly Canon could make it so that you could zoom in on the center of the selected item or something, or just zoom into the center of the frame and you have to move it and the AF kind of stops while you're magnified. I don't have a good answer to that, but being able to zoom in would be super useful. And like I said, shooting from a tripod makes it a little bit easier for you to work out what's going on. So one of the other problems, moving on from that, one of the other things I ran into are the exposure measurement tools. So the R5 has a histogram. The R5C has a waveform and a vector scope. It was very difficult. It was challenging, for me at least, to go back and forth between the two cameras, especially when shooting video. So this applies to shooting video more than stills, because the two cameras are the same for shooting stills. But when shooting video, it was very difficult for me to go back and forth between the two cameras because I was shooting video on both cameras. and not having a consistent way of looking at the exposure. So not consistently being able to bring up a histogram. Yes, I know, it's not the most cinema camera way of working, but it's on the R5. It's the only tool that's available there. Or having a waveform monitor in the R5 so that I can match what I would normally be using on the R5C. Minor nit, it wasn't end of the world or anything like that, but it was certainly something that kind of got frustrating. So let's move on to a couple specific things that are related to the cameras, specifically each camera as opposed to things as a whole. So first of all, R5C power. I ran a single battery in my camera with no battery grip. I didn't actually have a problem in this trip running it that way. However, the caveat to that was that my shooting with the R5C was much more limited than I had expected it to be because it was raining and snowing for the vast majority of the trip. And the R5C with the exposed ventilation, etc., I am not at all comfortable taking that camera out into rain or snow because it is not weather sealed the way that the R5 is. So I shot my R5C for video when it was clear in a number of circumstances, but nothing to the extent where the internal or the LPE6 battery actually ended up being a problem for me. That said, I did two things when I was working that way. So first of all, I had, as I showed in my rigging my R5C video, I had an LP or a USB PD power supply battery pack that I had mounted to the camera that I just used for the whole trip. I didn't always have it mounted to the camera, but I always had it in my bag. So if I went and I shot for 15 minutes or something like that with the R5C, when I got back to the car, get back to my bag, I just plugged the camera in and let the internal battery recharge. Probably not the best thing to do for battery longevity, etc., but keeping it topped off from a USB PD battery so that I always had the 50-ish minutes of record time seemed like a reasonable compromise in this situation. For longer stuff, I would have just plugged in the battery pack and mounted it on the camera. In fact, that's how I'm shooting this video right now. The USB PD battery pack is mounted on the camera the same way I showed it in my rigging video, and that's what's powering the camera, and it works fine. So I think I get about 4-ish, 5-ish hours, something like that, of record time out of the USB PD battery before it drops to the internal battery. Of course, that's, for me at least, plenty of time. So the power situation, as bad as it felt when I first got the camera, in practice, it wasn't really the issue that I thought it was going to be. Now, of course, that's because I've got an almost 100 watt-hour USB battery pack hooked up to the camera. But honestly, it's not completely unreasonable or infeasible, and I don't see it as that big of a negative. Custom shooting modes. So the R5C doesn't have custom shooting modes. The R5 does, even for video. I found the lack of them somewhat frustrating. Now, part of that, I think, stems from the fact that my background in photography is a still photographer. And as a still photographer, it's very much a case of, for me at least, of jumping out and shooting things really quickly and iterating very, very quickly. And I could do that with video on my R5 because I had, for example, one custom shooting mode set up for 4K 120, one custom shooting mode set up for 8K 24, and I could very, very easily, this is a scene that I think really is going to make more sense shooting it in 8K, hit the mode button, turn it to C3, shoot the scene for 5 or 10 minutes in 8K versus, this would make much more sense in 4K 120, hit the button, flip the mode 3 or 2, shoot 4K 120. On the R5C, those kinds of changes are considerably more cumbersome. So I did have buttons 9 and 10 on the R5C set to enable slow and fast mode, but you can't shoot slow motion or slow and fast. You can't shoot past, I think it's 60 frames a second or 30 frames a second. I don't even remember now. 8K, you can't shoot past, let's just say 60 frames a second in slow and fast mode. So you'll just because you can hit a button to drop the camera into slow and fast mode very quickly and you're shooting 8K doesn't mean that you're getting the ability to go to 120 frames per second, because you're not. So you have to change your resolution. So it's change the resolution, change the shutter speed, change the camera to slow and fast mode, change the shutter or the frame rate to 120. Now, because the camera was set to angle, I didn't have to change the shutter speed, so I guess that was a benefit. But it was much more cumbersome to make quick changes in a shoot. I'm shooting a waterfall. I was shooting it at 8K 24. I realized, this would be a cool thing to have in slow-mo, so I want to go 4K 120. It's a whole bunch of changes. What could I do about that? Well, I think the big thing for me is to stop thinking like a still photographer when trying to shoot video and slow down and realize that it's something that has to be done more deliberately or whatever. Of course, the flip side of that is that Canon really could put custom user modes in the R5C in video mode. So it very easily could be something that, and I'm not going to say I'm sure, but it seems like there's tons of uses where this could be applicable in, journalism, run and gun, say music, video, photography or videography, that kind of thing. We're having the ability to quickly make huge changes to all of the camera settings would be beneficial. So that's something that I would definitely like to see added to the R5C. So with the R5C out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the R5. The only thing I really have to say about the R5 that I don't want to say took me by surprise, but ended up being more of a thing than I think I was expecting it to be, was the thermal limits when shooting video. So prior to this trip, I shot nothing in 8K other than to just test it out. I don't have a real use for 8K. I probably didn't need to shoot this trip in 8K, except my thought process was, if I shoot in 8K, I have a 32, 35 megapixel, whatever it is, I think 32 megapixels still. So if I have some really good image of bison or bears or wolves or something like that in the video, I can pull that frame, make a print from it, and have a reasonably decent quality, high resolution still that I can do something with, as opposed to just having the video going on. The thermal recording limits, I never actually ran into them. So shooting at 8K 24 and 4K 120, there are thermal limits. The camera can't go forever and ever and ever. But for a couple of reasons, really, I never actually ran into them, but they did cause some anxiety, which I think is the biggest problem, in my opinion, for them. So I was hand-holding almost everything I shot video. The image stabilization, by the way, on the R5 worked fantastic. Well, mostly fantastic for shooting video. There are some issues in some places where the image stabilization's yaw and tilt makes the corners of the images a little wonky in wide angle shots. And I think that might also be a product from the lens too. It's not great, but it's, other than that, the image stabilization worked incredibly well, I felt, for shooting video. I was hand-holding it. I can't hand-hold and shoot video for more than 5 minutes anyway. So, shooting a 5-minute clip is pretty easy if you're on a tripod. It's a lot harder, I find, or for me at least, if I'm doing it handheld. And of course, if you're talking 120 frames per second, that stretches things out fivefold, for me at least, because I do everything in 24p, stretches things out fivefold. So 1 minute becomes 5 minutes, and 5 minutes becomes 25 minutes worth of video, at least assuming you've slowed the whole thing down. Both of those were well within the realm of what the camera would allow me to do. I don't ever recall seeing the camera say that I had less than 10 minutes at 8K or less than the 7 minutes and 29 seconds, which is the maximum record time at 4K 120, due to the file's time limit things. I don't ever remember having a problem with that at all. Now, the other thing that I found interesting is ambient temperatures didn't seem to make much of a difference. So when on this trip, temperatures, I was shooting in temperatures ranging from 40 to like 65 or 70 degrees. Cloudy, sunny, didn't really matter. I didn't see an appreciable change in the ambient or the record time limits based on ambient temperature, in the sense that the camera cooled down quicker or stayed cooler longer or something like that. Of course, compounding the issues at the same time, I was often shooting stills and video in the same sort of breath or same area, and that certainly was going to impact the extent of what I could shoot. Other than that, the R5 worked brilliant for this, well, as much as I expect, because I've shot with the R5 for over almost 2 years now. Talk about the RF 100 to 500 and the teleconverter. So, lens performed well. I expected it to. I've done some testing with it. I've done some shoots with it. It worked well in those. I expected it to work well on the trip. As a substitute for a 600 f4, I was completely happy with it. The only reason that I would find that I would want a 600 f4 really came down to, when you're shooting something and somebody rocked up with a 600 f4, it was psychological. It wasn't actually a functional thing that was a problem. So last time I was in Yellowstone, I had a 600 f4. This time I had the 100 to 500. And I found broadly, I approached everything essentially the same way with the 100 to 500. The image stabilization and focusing on the lens were rock solid, even with the teleconverter attached, which of course is good news. The biggest problem that I ran into the whole trip with the 100 to 500, and this has been a problem that I've increasingly been seeing with my R5, with the high resolution sensor. And I've had people with Nikon Z9s, which are similarly 45 megapixel sensors, professional photographers, say the same thing to me. So I'm not with brilliant Nikon glass. So this is not a Canon problem. It is not a in-body stabilization Canon problem or a Canon lens problem. It's purely, as far as I can tell, a problem of increased resolution. And that's atmospheric and heat shimmer. So I have had no end of problems with shooting, even in cold temperatures, where I don't get as sharp of an image as I would like because of shimmer from atmospheric heat. I can tell it's that because in, for example, video that I shot, you can actually see the background shimmering the way you would expect to see from heat-related shimmer. I just don't... This is a frustration. I don't see an easy solution for this. I don't see a great solution for this. What I see is you just have to try and deal with it, or you have to accept it. So of course, shooting earlier in the morning before things get hot is obviously going to be a great way to compensate that. But I was seeing issues even on overcast days in the mid-50s. So not exactly a hot day, not exactly the sun beating down, and I'm not shooting, in those cases, I wasn't shooting across an asphalt road or something like that. It was all grass. I saw the same problems to a lesser extent with I saw them with my 100 to 400 on the R5, so it's not strictly related to the 100 to 500 RF. I saw them in certain instances with the 600 f4 and a teleconverter on my 5D Mark IV the last time I was out there. But with the 5D being a lower resolution camera, it didn't seem to be as significant or obvious as it was with the higher resolution R5. That said, one of the things that this trip I think reinforced is my belief that the Canon 100-500 is easily the best lightweight the most flexible, and from my position, that makes it one of the better or the best lightweight wildlife lenses on the market. And my reasoning for this comes down to the 100mm on the wide end makes it generally flexible, or more flexible than a lot of the other options. So you have the 150 to 600s. They don't give you the 100 to 50 or the 100 to 150 range, which ends up meaning you need a 70 to 200 to cover close in, anything that's close in, or just wide angle. That 50 millimeters is, in my experience, a pretty big deal. And I've certainly run into instances with my 100 to 400 where I had a teleconverter on the lens and I needed to zoom out wider than 140, and 100 would have been more than adequate, but because I had the teleconverter on the lens, I just couldn't do it. 100 or 150 is way better than the 200 that you end up with on stuff like the Nikon 200 to 500 or Sony's 200 to 600. Now, you can make arguments that they're big lenses or whatever, but, again, you need a 70 to 200 to cover the close-in stuff with those. And for me, at least, I'm trying to travel light. I'm trying to not have to carry more glass than I really need. I'm down to basically 3 lenses. On this trip, I took my 15 to 35, my 24 to 70, and my 100 to 500. I really didn't need to take the 15 to 35, but I was expecting or hoping for better conditions in certain areas that I would have been able to potentially use it, but I didn't because it rained and I couldn't go shoot the things that I wanted with a 15. But generally speaking, I find that my 15 to 35, it's one of my favorite lenses to shoot with from a wide angle perspective or make interesting images perspective, but it's definitely an image or a lens that I don't use an awful lot. But between the 24 to 70 and the 100 to 500, and a teleconverter, I found that I, could pretty much cover everything that I would want to shoot in landscapes and wildlife. So on the flip side, the 100 is wide enough to make the lens really flexible for the close-in stuff. Generally, 500 I find to be more than adequate for the telephoto end of things. So like I said, I have consistently been running into problems with atmospheric shimmer. The result of that is it's better to get closer than get a longer lens. And what I have found more and more in shooting with a long lens in the last couple of years is that if I'm shooting past 500 or 600 millimeters, where if I need to go further than that to frame the image that I want, and it's not a bird 10 or 15 feet away, it's not going to be the greatest image that I shot either. It's going to have problems due to atmospheric, the shimmer and distortion from the atmosphere. 600 maybe would have been a bit better, but on the same token, you can shoot a little loose at 500 and crop with a 45 megapixel sensor, and it really kind of works. There's enough resolution for you to play with it. And then general, like I said, lightweight is my thing, and the 100 to 500 is lighter than pretty much anything else that's out there right now. So it's lighter than the Nikon F-mount 200 to 500. It's lighter than Sony's 200 to 600. It's lighter than the Sigma 150 to 600s, and in most cases by about 50%, or it's about 50% the weight. So yes, I know the Nikon was a DSLR lens. Yes, I know Nikon has a very good 100 to 400 now for their Z platform. I've even done some tests with one, or done some test shots with one. But quite honestly, having shot with a 100 to 400, the flexibility of being able to go to 500, I like better than just being limited to 100 to 400. The only real complaint, and this was a concern that I had from the start, but the only real complaint that I end up having is that the teleconverter can only be mounted to the 100 to 500 from 300 mil when the lens is zoomed to 300 millimeters or longer. Now, the pro of this whole thing, in my opinion, is because it's a 100 to 500, I don't need the teleconverter as often. I almost always was putting a teleconverter on my 100 to 400 because the extra of getting it out to 560 really made a difference, for me at least. In the case of the 100 to 500, I'm already getting out to 500. Going to 750 or 700 is not as beneficial in as many situations, or is not as necessary in many situations. So I didn't need to use it an awful lot. That said, the mounting and dismounting of it I found to be fairly awkward. It's always awkward mounting and dismounting a teleconverter. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just the nature of the beast. But doing that with having to also have the lens partially zoomed or fully zoomed out made that more awkward. Plus, the 100 to 500 doesn't have a zoom lock. It has a friction control. And when the friction control is set all the way to the highest friction setting, you can still zoom the lens I won't say fairly easily, but it's easy enough to zoom the lens that, I don't necessarily always release the friction control unless I expect to have to make really fast zoom movements, because I can make those kind of movements with the friction set up. So not exactly, I was concerned that this was going to be a problem. It bared out a lot of the ways that I kind of expected, in that it wasn't as necessary. It is awkward doing it, at least if you don't have the lens on a tripod. On the tripod, it would be much easier to deal with. Practice doing it helped after a day or three of making a couple of mounts or dismounts a day. It got much easier to deal with, but it's still not the optimal situation. Personally, for me, if I'm going to have a lens with a teleconverter, I would vastly prefer integral teleconverters, like the 200 to 400, the 180 to 400, that kind of lens, Nikon's 400-28Z. Flip a switch, you have a teleconverter that it's on, it's off, it doesn't matter. Barring that, I really feel like the teleconverter or the lens should be able to fully collapse when the teleconverter is mounted. My concern, in this didn't bear out on this trip, but it's still something that's in the back of my head, is that if you're talking about you're in a situation and the weather gets bad and you need to put the camera away, with the 100 to 400 with the teleconverter mounted, I could collapse the lens and put it in my backpack. I could just, before I went out, made sure that it was enough room for the lens collapsed with the teleconverter in place. With the 100 to 500, you have to take the lens apart to get it to fully collapse, which means that, or it takes up a whole lot of space in the bag, which means it's that much harder to put away in a rush in an adverse weather situation. Like I said, it's really mitigated by the fact that the lens simply, you don't need the teleconverter anywhere near as much as I felt, at least, that I needed it on a 100 to 400. So let's move on to the last thing that I want to talk about in this video, and I think I'm going to wrap it up after that, which is the MacBook Pro M1. The M1, this is the first time I've taken the M1 out in the field. This is the first time I've done any real serious processing on the M1 in a bigger context or a more significant context. So I talked briefly about speccing my M1 back when I ordered it in December of last year, so December of 21 or early January of 22 when I did a vlog on it. But just to quickly recap, I bought a 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro. It's got the Max CPU, M1 Max, so the bottom tier M1 Max CPU, so it's 10 CPU cores, 24 GPU cores. I got mine configured with 64 gig of RAM and a terabyte of storage. That seemed to be, I felt like that was the best configuration. The RAM might be overkill, but on the same token, the integrated GPU uses system memory. I didn't know how much that was actually going to work out to be. And between Lightroom and Resolve and Photoshop, I've easily maxed out the 32 gig that I have in my desktop. My next desktop will absolutely have 64 gig in it, given my experiences since I started shooting or doing video. That seemed right. Now, storage, obviously, I probably could have put more in, but storage is also one of those aspects of the computer that you can plug in a USB SSD and, I would say have unlimited storage, but you can have as much storage as you have USB SSDs. So that all was kind of in my thought process. So how did it work out? Well, first of all, it rendered my iPad Pro largely superfluous. I've always traveled with an iPad Pro as a content consumption device. Watch movies on it on the plane, etc., that kind of thing. I can use it for maps when I'm driving or whatnot if I need a bigger map than my phone or whatever it can provide. The battery life on the MacBook Pro M1 is so good that I basically didn't have to worry about running out of power in a day if I wanted to watch a movie, if I wanted to stitch some panos together. That was really, really a huge positive point. Second of all, the form factor. I had been concerned slightly when I originally ordered it that maybe I should have gone with the 16-inch instead of the 14-inch because it's bigger screen, blah, blah, blah. I ended up going with the 14-inch because when traveling, I wanted something where I could actually use it on a plane on the tray table in front of me and not have to worry about the monitor getting broken or crushed or something because the person in the seat in front of me leaned back. Absolutely proved out to be the case. It's the first trip that I've actually been able to do something on the plane with my laptop other than watch a movie. I could actually sit there, write a script, do some research for a script, etc., in a way that I've never been able to do before. So I think the form factor was absolutely the right size for a travel computer or traveling user. Finally, power capabilities, performance, whatever you want to call it. It was absolutely powerful enough, or is absolutely powerful enough to be used in the field for compute-heavy tasks. This was the first time that I have ever, in any of my trips or travels, I have ever pulled out my laptop in the middle of, a parking lot somewhere where I had just shot a pano, stuck the SD card in from the camera so I shoot, I generally don't need tons of frame or a huge buffer when I'm shooting stills, especially for landscapes. So I generally shoot still images to SD cards and shoot video to CF Express cards in my R5s. So one of the benefits of doing that is that there's an SD card reader on the MacBook Pro, so you could just pop the SD card out of the camera, stick it in the MacBook Pro, fire up Lightroom, download the stuff that I wanted, and stitch a pano together. And this was the first time that I've ever been able to, ever really been able to do that in the field on the run. Now, it eats battery when you do that. It's not exactly, as great as battery life is in the M1 Mac when you're doing text editing or browsing the web or watching a video that the hardware engine can play back, when you actually throw a computational problem at it, like rendering an HDR pano or a 250 megapixel HDR pano, it eats battery. That's the reality. It's the thing everybody wants to ignore, that physics says it's going to consume power. But it didn't eat so much battery in the number of times that I did this that I couldn't recharge the laptop or even had to necessarily recharge the laptop. The only time I ran into a situation where I finished stitching a pano together, I looked at the battery indicator and said, I should plug this in and recharge it right now. I didn't recharge it the day before, and I'd been doing the same thing, so I didn't even go into it with a full charge that day with a full charge. I went into that day with maybe 50% charge or something like that, and I was down to like 28 or something like that percent charge after using it through the day, not just for one pano. But that made it very easy to throw the images in, stitch a pano, verify that everything worked out well, that I didn't have blurry images, that I didn't have problems, that I didn't need to reshoot. And I could do that right there while I was right where I was shooting, in the same lighting conditions and everything that I was shooting in, it not in, like coming back the next day to fix a problem that I only discovered when I looked at the thing in a hotel room that night. So very pleased with the performance of the M1 MacBook Pro. I think the cameras and lenses all worked out very well as a whole as well. There are, of course, some things that I think Canon could definitely improve on. There's some things that I certainly could improve on myself. But as a whole, I didn't have any real complaints or beefs with any of the gear that I used. It all pretty much did what it's advertised to do and what I needed it to do. So I'm going to wrap this up here. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. If you know somebody that might be interested in this type of thing, this discussion, please share it with them. It helps them, it helps me, it helps everybody. Makes you look like a hero in the process as well. And if you found this useful or interesting, please consider hitting the like button to let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.